In the autumn of 1943, Allied planners staring at maps of the Normandy coastline faced a problem that had no obvious solution. Every deep-water port along the French Atlantic and Channel coast was heavily fortified. Cherbourg, Le Havre, Boulogne. All of them bristled with German coastal artillery, and all of them would almost certainly be destroyed or sabotaged the moment an Allied invasion began. Without a port, an invading army could not be resupplied. Without resupply, an invasion could not be sustained beyond a matter of days. The Germans understood this arithmetic perfectly. Their entire coastal defense strategy assumed that any Allied landing, wherever it occurred, would eventually have to seize a port, and that seizing a port could be made catastrophically costly. What German planners did not anticipate was that the Allies intended to bring their own harbor with them, in pieces, across 60 miles of open water. The solution that emerged from British engineering circles was, on paper, absurd. Two complete artificial harbors, codenamed Mulberry A and Mulberry B, would be constructed in sections across dozens of shipyards and construction sites in Britain, towed across the English Channel under naval escort, and assembled directly on the invasion beaches within days of the landings. Each harbor would require breakwaters, floating roadways, pierheads capable of handling ocean-going vessels, and enough sheltered water to unload thousands of tons of supplies daily. The engineering firm responsible for coordinating this effort estimated that the completed harbors would use more steel and concrete than a medium-sized permanent port, built not over years, but delivered ready-made within a single week of fighting. The construction program that followed remains one of the most tightly compartmentalized engineering projects of the Second World War. More than 1.5 million tons of concrete and steel were allocated to the effort, distributed across construction sites the length of Britain, from the Thames estuary to the Solent. Workers building individual components, the massive concrete caissons codenamed Phoenix units, some standing 6 stories tall and weighing over 6,000 tons apiece, were frequently not told what they were building or why. Many assumed they were constructing floating gun emplacements or coastal defense structures. The compartmentalization was deliberate and absolute. German intelligence, despite extensive aerial reconnaissance of British shipyards throughout early 1944, never assembled a coherent picture of what was being prepared. The scale of secrecy extended even to the language used in official correspondence. Engineers referred to floating roadway sections as whales, their supporting pontoons as beetles, and the outer breakwaters made from scuttled ships as gooseberries. No single document, if intercepted, would have revealed the complete picture. The Phoenix caissons alone required over 200 separate construction sites working simultaneously, each producing components that would only make sense once towed to Normandy and assembled alongside hundreds of others. When the invasion fleet departed Portsmouth and Southampton in the first days of June 1944, it towed behind it not just landing craft and warships, but an entire disassembled port, perhaps the single largest civil engineering project ever transported by sea in world history. The Mulberry Harbours began arriving off the Normandy beaches within 48 hours of the initial landings on June 6, 1944. Mulberry A was assigned to Omaha Beach in the American sector. Mulberry B, later known as Port Winston, was assigned to Gold Beach in the British sector. The assembly process itself was an engineering operation conducted under active combat conditions, with German artillery still within range of the construction sites, and Luftwaffe aircraft making sporadic bombing runs against the assembling structures. Royal Engineers and American Naval Construction Battalions worked in shifts around the clock, scuttling block ships to form the outer gooseberry breakwaters, then maneuvering the massive Phoenix caissons into precise position using compressed air valves that allowed controlled flooding and sinking. Within 10 days, both harbors were substantially operational, handling a combined total that exceeded even the most optimistic pre-war projections. Port Winston alone would eventually process more than 500,000 tons of supplies, 40,000 vehicles, and over 220,000 personnel in the months following the invasion, figures that transformed it, for a period, into one of the busiest ports in the world, rivaling the throughput of established facilities like Dover or Southampton. But the two harbors would not share the same fate. On June 19, 1944, a violent Channel storm, the worst in the region in over 40 years, struck the Normandy coast and lasted 3 days. Mulberry A, still incomplete and less robustly anchored than its British counterpart, was effectively destroyed, its phoenix caissons breached and its floating roadways, torn apart by wave action that exceeded anything the engineering specifications had accounted for. The storm of June 1944 forced an immediate and consequential decision. Rather than attempt a costly reconstruction of the American harbor, Allied planners made the pragmatic choice to cannibalize the wreckage of Mulberry A, salvaging usable components to reinforce and extend Port Winston, which had weathered the storm with comparatively minor damage. From that point forward, American forces would rely primarily on direct beach landings, a method that, contrary to pre-war assumptions, proved more resilient and adaptable than planners had initially believed, and which would eventually see Omaha Beach itself handling substantial tonnage through improvised methods, alongside the later capture and rapid repair of Cherbourg's deep-water port facilities. In late June 1944, Port Winston, meanwhile, continued operating for nearly 10 months, far exceeding its original design lifespan of 90 days. Its floating roadways, intended as a temporary expedient, proved durable enough to support continuous heavy vehicle traffic well into the following year, even as the front lines moved deeper into France and the strategic necessity of the harbor gradually diminished. By late 1944, with Antwerp's deep-water port facilities captured and cleared of German mines and obstructions, and with the front hundreds of miles inland, Port Winston's operational relevance began to fade, not through destruction, but through simple strategic obsolescence. The war had moved on, and the harbor that had once been indispensable became, almost overnight, a piece of increasingly redundant infrastructure sitting in shallow water off a French beach town. If the scale of secrecy behind Allied engineering projects like this fascinates you, consider subscribing. Every week, this channel traces what became of the machines and structures that shaped the outcome of the war. Unlike the Lancaster bombers scrapped in systematic post-war disposal programs, the Mulberry Harbor components faced no formal decommissioning process. Most of Port Winston's structure was simply left in place after 1945, considered too costly to dismantle and of insufficient value to justify the salvage effort that had been applied to so much other wartime hardware. The floating roadway sections, no longer maintained, gradually broke free of their moorings over subsequent decades, some drifting along the Normandy coast before finally grounding or sinking. The massive phoenix caissons, built to withstand naval bombardment, proved far more resistant to the passage of time than anyone anticipated. Many remain visible today at low tide off Arromanches, Lisbon, their concrete hulks weathered but structurally intact. More than 80 years after their construction, the town of Arromanches, which sat directly behind Port Winston, developed almost accidentally into a site of memory and pilgrimage. What was never formally preserved became, through simple inertia and the durability of reinforced concrete, one of the most visually striking surviving monuments of the entire Normandy campaign. Local fishermen and residents in the years immediately following the war treated the sunken and grounded components as a navigational hazard and a source of scrap metal. And it is estimated that a meaningful percentage of the original Phoenix caissons were partially broken down for their steel reinforcement bars during the lean years of French post-war reconstruction, a quiet echo of the same economic pressures that drove the scrapping of surplus Lancaster bombers on the other side of the Channel. Today, the remnants of Port Winston constitute one of the largest accessible pieces of D-Day-era engineering anywhere in the world, protected not by museum walls but by the simple fact that nobody ever found it economical to remove them. Roughly 15 Phoenix caissons remain visible in the waters off Arromanches, forming an unmistakable silhouette against the horizon that draws visitors to the D-Day Landing Museum, built directly on the beach where the harbor once operated. At exceptionally low tides, sections of the original floating roadway, the Whales, can still be found partially buried in the sand, their rusted steel spine barely distinguishable from the debris of the beach itself. Underwater archaeological surveys conducted in the decades since have periodically added new detail to the historical record, mapping the scattered debris field of Mulberry A off Omaha Beach and documenting the corrosion patterns of the surviving Gold Beach structures. Unlike the deliberate scrapping campaigns that reduced thousands of Lancaster bombers to a handful of survivors, the Mulberry Harbours were never destroyed by policy. They were simply abandoned to the tide. And the tide, it turned out, was a far gentler custodian than the hydraulic shears and cutting torches that awaited Britain's surplus aircraft. What survives at Arromanches today survives almost by accident, an unintended monument shaped more by the economics of neglect than by any conscious act of preservation. The moral and historical questions surrounding the Mulberry Harbours are, in some respects, gentler than those attached to a strategic bombing campaign. But they are not absent. The harbors existed to enable an invasion that would ultimately cost tens of thousands of Allied and civilian lives across the Normandy campaign, and their success is inseparable from the immense human cost of the battle that followed their construction. Standing on the beach at Arromanches today, looking out at the gray caissons still breaking the surface of the water at low tide, it is difficult not to hold two things at once. Astonishment at an engineering achievement that remains, by any measure, one of the most audacious logistical undertakings in military history, and an awareness of exactly what that achievement was built to accomplish. What is certain is that the survival of Port Winston's remains, unplanned, unfunded, and largely unintentional, stands in sharp contrast to the fate of so much other wartime engineering. No formal decision preserved it. No museum board voted to protect it. It simply proved too large, too solid, and too embedded in the seabed to be worth the cost of removing. And in that accidental persistence, the Normandy coastline retained a piece of history that more deliberate stewardship elsewhere so often failed to save. 80 years after the storm that destroyed its sister harbor at Omaha Beach, Port Winston's caissons still stand in the tide off Arromanches. Not because anyone decided they should, but because no one ever decided they shouldn't. If this exploration of wartime engineering and what became of it interested you, the story of the Lancaster bomber fleet and how nearly all 7,000 of them vanished within a decade of the war's end covers similar ground from a very different angle. Thank you for watching.